My name's Andrew Watson, I'm Bishop of Guildford, and I'm standing in Guildford Cathedral in the Treasury where we have an exhibition of Magna Carta. It was in the Guildford Diocese in Runnymede that Magna Carta was famously first sealed on the 15th of June 1215, and we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta all this week, and indeed this year. It's lovely wandering around the exhibition. There were a number of different items on display. The one that I think I enjoyed most was a Tony Hancock sketch from his Hancock's Half Hour, where as a barrister he asked the question, does Magna Carta mean nothing to you? Did she die in vain? And I think there's something about that kind of reminds us that although we see Magna Carta as a foundational document, a lot of people haven't really read it, certainly not before this year, and it's good to be reflecting on it in this podcast. We're now standing in front of a facsimile of the Magna Carta, a rather beautiful facsimile from the Salisbury Magna Carta, and I'm delighted to be here with Professor Nigel Saul, who's a Professor of Medieval History at the Royal Holloway College in the University of London. So, Professor Nigel, what do you see as we look at this rather beautiful manuscript of the Magna Carta?
It's a magnificent reproduction, isn't it? It's just as if you're looking at the original document in Salisbury Cathedral. Magna Carta, it's Latin, of course, meaning the Great Charter. As we look at it, we can see that by medieval standards, it's actually quite a long document. It runs to about 3,500 to 4,000 words. It's written in Latin. It would have taken a scribe pretty well all day to write it out. The scribe would have been using a quill, handwriting all day, and notice that it's in very careful, decorative handwriting. We don't know who actually wrote this copy. It's possible, to put it no more strongly, it's just possible that it was written by Elias de Derham, who was a canon of Salisbury Cathedral and who was one of Archbishop Langton's own clerks. This one at Salisbury is one of just 4 surviving originals of the 1215 Charter. The others are one at Lincoln Cathedral and the other 2 at the British Library in London.
Yes, it's a beautiful document and, as you say, wonderfully inscribed. Whoever wrote it had the most beautiful handwriting. And it is moving to stand in front of this document. It's a page of, I guess, sort of A3 in modern parlance, or a little bit smaller than that. And just to see this document, which has been so foundational to our legal and political system in many ways, and the legal and political systems of many other liberal democracies around the world.
I think the thing about Magna Carta is that it's not a document which is important because of its beauty, its illuminations, its pictures, or anything like that. It's a very plain, unadorned piece of parchment. The importance of Magna Carta is its power, the extraordinary power that this plain piece of parchment has had over the centuries.
So who wrote the Magna Carta?
Magna Carta was a classic committee job. Different people were responsible for the drafting of different clauses of it. It's not like, say, the American Declaration of Independence, where you can say this was very much the work of Thomas Jefferson. There wasn't a Thomas Jefferson figure there at Runnymede in June 1215. It consists of 63 clauses. Each of those clauses addresses a specific grievance and offers a remedy to it. So what you have to imagine is all sorts of people coming along there in June 1215, all with their own grievances about this, about that, climbing on the bandwagon, and all of these grievances fed into the making of the Charter. Very much a committee job. Let me give you just one example. Clause 13 guarantees the liberties of the City of London. That was drafted by the Londoners. They'd given their support to the barons in May. For them, the meeting at Runnymede, the drafting of the Charter, was payback time. We've given you our support. We want payback, guarantee of the liberties of the City of London.
Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, was obviously quite a key player in the whole development of Magna Carta. Can you tell me a little bit about your sense of his role in the whole proceedings?
Langton was a hugely important figure, a very distinguished intellectual. He'd spent the greater part of his life as a teacher in the University of Paris. He was a university man, like, say, Rowan Williams was in our own time. In 1206, he'd been chosen to be the next, I should correct that, he was appointed the next Archbishop of Canterbury by the Pope, but King John didn't want him. So John had kept him out, but by 1213, the quarrel had been solved. John had submitted to the Pope, and Langton was back in England. In the negotiations in June 1215, he acted very much as the go-between between the two sides, engaging in sort of shuttle diplomacy between the king, who was based at Windsor, and the barons, who by now were based on the other side of the river, a few miles away at Thames. He's going backwards and forwards, helping to negotiate the terms. But he did not actually write the charter. He did not actually draft the charter. As I say, that reflects many different interests. It's a classic committee job. But one clause of the charter very much bears his imprint, and that is Clause 1, which guaranteed the liberties of the Church in England.
And so this role of peacemaker, reconciler, was quite a key part, do you think, of how Stephen Langton saw his place, sort of honest broker between the barons and the king?
Absolutely. As I say, Clause 1 is the only one which you can say was written by the Church and in the interests of the Church. I think Langton saw himself as the negotiator, the peacemaker. That would have been entirely in tradition with the way the Church did business, with the way that he as Archbishop saw his role in 1215. Remember, he'd been kept out of the country by the king for 5 years because John did not want him to be Archbishop of Canterbury. John had his own candidate to be the next Archbishop, and it was emphatically not Langton, who, after all, as I say, had been in France for umpteen years. Langton was no friend of the king. On the other hand, he was not a rebel, and he didn't want to be seen as a rebel. The quarrel with the Church had been settled. John had accepted Langton as Archbishop. He'd restored the confiscated property of the Church. So the quarrel with the Church was over. John had submitted himself to be a good son of the Church. So the position for Langton was he didn't like King John. Just like everybody else, he regarded John as a slippery customer. But because the quarrel with the Church had been settled, he could not support rebellion. Therefore, his interest was in negotiation, reconciliation, and peace.
I'm conscious that Stephen Langton was obviously something of a canon lawyer as well, along with others, and the canon lawyers at the time seemed to be wrestling with exactly the kind of concepts which Magna Carta very much puts forward, many of which they got from the book of Deuteronomy. I'm very interested by these verses from Deuteronomy chapter 16 about the appointment of judges and officials. You must not distort justice, you must not show partiality, and you must not accept bribes, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Justice, and only justice, you shall pursue. Rather sort of FIFA texts, I think, at the moment. And then a little bit later on in chapter 17, the limitations of royal authority in the book of Deuteronomy. One of your own community you may set as king over you. He must not acquire many horses for himself. He must not acquire many wives for himself. Also silver and gold he must not acquire. And then this rather interesting part where it talks about how he's to have the law written out in the presence of the priests in order that he might diligently observe all the words of this law, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left. I mean, this isn't quite the language of Magna Carta, but quite a lot of the sort of themes are coming through way back in the book of Deuteronomy. And tell me about those sort of roots of some of the key themes of the Charter.
You're absolutely right. Those verses in Deuteronomy 17 constitute key texts for this discussion. Remember, as we said earlier, Stephen Langton had spent the bulk of his adult career, just as Rowan Williams had, as a university teacher. And instead of Oxford and Cambridge, in the case of Rowan Williams, it's the University of Paris, the schools of Paris. That was where Langton had studied and taught. And Langton was above all a biblical commentator. He was a theologian, a biblical exegetist. So he would have read those clauses, those verses, and he would have reflected on them and commented on them and discussed them with his students. Being a theologian, most of his teaching and his writing was strictly theological. But when thinking about and writing about verses such as those, you could not do that without thinking about contemporary issues as well. You could not comment on those verses without thinking about the obligations of a Christian to an unjust king. They raised the question, two related questions, of how do you regulate kingly government, and what does the subject do in the event that the king is ruling unjustly. And of course these were very present issues in England in the reign of King John. John was a bad king. We can settle that one very quickly. Everything that you read in the popular books about King John, most of it is right. He was an unjust king. So the question that faced Langton in 1214 and 1215, the question that faced so many people in England in 1214 and 1215 was, what do you do about an unjust king? How do you constrain him? And in answering those questions, Langton would have been guided by the evidence there in Scripture in Deuteronomy 17. And I think Langton's thoughts would have crystallized on two main ideas. The first was that a king should rule in accordance with the law. Deuteronomy 17 makes that very clear. And in contemporary thinking, a king who did not rule in accordance with the law was a tyrant. That was their definition of tyranny. And the second thing was the question of when and in what circumstances could a subject rebel and disobey. And Langton's answer to that one, as it was the answer of his teacher Peter the Chanter in Paris, was that a subject is entitled to disobey a king if a king rules without judgment. If a king gives an order that defies judgment, is not justiciable, then the subject is entitled to disobey. You can see the analogies with June 1215 in England very closely there.
And I think I'm right that the Church was also quite involved in the promulgation of the Magna Carta. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's one of the new discoveries that's been made in the last few years. The position in England in the 12th and 13th centuries was very simple. When a king wrote letters or published a charter, it was distributed through the sheriffs. The sheriffs were the main agents of local government. Every day, the sheriff here in Guildford Castle, for example, would have received writs, letters, charters from the king, which he would have published and circulated in his bailiwick of Surrey. Now, in 1215, the barons, having made King John agree to the charter, could not use that network for the distribution of the charter, because the sheriffs were all the king's men. They were the baddies. Most medieval sheriffs were baddies most of the time. We know that from the Robin Hood ballads. We've got the King John Ladybird book just behind us. Sheriffs were baddies. People didn't trust them. But the barons trusted the sheriffs least of all, because they were the king's men. So how are you going to organise distribution and publication of the charter? Use the people that you could trust, the people who were the negotiators, the conciliators, the honest brokers, the bishops. So distribution was through the bishops. And this helps to explain why two of the four surviving originals are in our cathedrals, Salisbury and Lincoln, and one of the two in the British Library has recently been shown to have been Stephen Langton's own copy, and that would have gone to Canterbury Cathedral.
So when we consider Stephen Langton's role as peacemaker, sort of shuttling from one side to the other, and when we consider the roots of many of the key aspects of the Magna Carta in the book of Deuteronomy and thinking around that, and also the Church's role in promulgating it, I guess today many people say the Church shouldn't be involved in politics. I mean, would it be too much to say that if the Church hadn't been involved in politics in the 13th century, the Magna Carta would never have been?
That's a very difficult question, of course, and I think even Langton himself would have hesitated a little before giving an answer. Langton, I think, would have said, I'm not being directly political here. What I'm doing is bringing people together. The issue of the king's quarrel with the church, that was solved the year before. My interest now is in bringing peace to England and bringing the two sides together and making sure that the king rules under the law. But I'm dodging the question and you want a straight answer. I think my straight answer would be, yes, it probably is fair to say that without the church and without Langton, we would not have Magna Carta today. And I say that because although Langton's signature is not directly on the Charter, as I've said, only one clause of the Charter can be directly attributed to Langton. The rest of it is very secular. Nonetheless, the ideas developed in the Church of a king ruling justly and a king ruling under and in accordance with the law, clause 39, that reflects the thinking of the Church. And I think we can also make a connection with clause 40. Clause 40 famously says, to no one shall we sell, delay or deny right or justice. Langton, in ordinances which he'd published the year before in 1214, forbade church officials from taking bribes. That, particularly bribes to accelerate or delay justice, that directly anticipates clause 40. So I think I would say that ideas which had been developed over the previous decades, the previous half century or more, in the Church, feed through into secular society and feed through into and inform the making of specific clauses in the Charter. So we owe the Church a great deal. I think in the 13th century the Church had a strong sense of what was just and what was unjust. I think the bishops, in the back of their minds, had got some sort of idea of what constituted justice. And this was part of Stephen Langton's legacy to the English Church in the 13th century. The idea that the Church was a source of moral authority in the realm, a source of ideas biblically based on what constituted good kingship, good rulership, and some sort of idea of the circumstances in which the king's subjects might not rebel against him, of course, that was unpardonable, but at least challenge him and get him to rethink the position that he'd taken. So in the reign of Henry III, for example, we see one of Langton's former pupils, Edmund Rich, later St Edmund of Abingdon, challenging Henry III. In the reigns of Edward I and Edward II, we find two successive archbishops of Canterbury, John Peckham and Robert Winchelsea. Peckham ordering copies of Magna Carta to be put on display in the country's cathedral churches, and Robert Winchelsea in Edward II's reign saying to the king, I want Magna Carta reissued. The bishops saw it as part of their role to challenge kings. And I suppose you can see in that an anticipation of the Church today challenging governments to rethink matters that they think the government ought to reconsider.
Yes, and again, I guess that's a tradition that's quite rooted in the Old Testament prophets, who were precisely there quite often to challenge the kings of their day, calling them back to true allegiance to the Lord and to look after the needs of the poor and so on. It was, in a way, that kind of thinking, I guess, that inspired Langton and those who followed him.
My goodness, when Langton thought about King John, he must have thought, well, bad as King John is, he's not half as bad as some of those kings that you read about in the Old Testament, in Samuel and the Book of Kings. Exactly. The prophets knew all about how to deal with appalling kings. With all that in mind, remember, as I've said, Langton was a biblical commentator. He could see these. He was an Old Testament king living in his own kingdom. Langton applied the lessons that he learned from biblical commentary to the here and now, to dealing with King John in the present. So yes, biblical commentary informed present policy in the 13th century.
As I've reflected on this 800th anniversary, I've been conscious that the Church has a lot to learn about it from its forebears 800 years ago, particularly in that reconciliation role that Stephen Langton had between the Baron and the Kings, about the application of ancient wisdom, specifically scriptural wisdom, to modern issues, and also about the call to justice. In the Anglican Communion, we have a mission statement called the 5 Marks of Mission, and the 4th mark of mission is confronting injustice wherever we see it. And in many senses, Magna Carta is about, among other things, confronting injustice and an improper use of authority. Just looking at on a more sort of global level, obviously the Magna Carta has been subject to much mythology that has been built around it. What do you see as the key themes that are still relevant to life in the 21st century?
Yes, there's certainly been an enormous amount of mythologizing about Magna Carta, an enormous amount. And I suppose the historian's job is partly to do demythologizing. But let me assure you, I'm not going to be a spoil sport. Magna Carta is undeniably a very important document. It's probably the world's most famous document, and rightly so. One bit of demythologizing, I think, is in order. Magna Carta did not establish democracy. Definitely, Magna Carta did not establish democracy. But Magna Carta established something which must be and is a precondition for democracy, and that is the rule of law. Without the rule of law, you cannot have a democracy. And the rule of law in this country was established by the Great Charter. In the next reign, Henry III's reign, Bracton was to say, in England the king is below God and below the law. That is what Magna Carta established. So I think it's hugely important in establishing that principle, which is the foundation of our liberty, the foundation of our government in this country, the rule of law. That is important for us, and that is why this anniversary is worth celebrating. But I would also end by saying that Magna Carta is to an extent international, because the ideas of Magna Carta inform the constitutions, the legal systems of many other countries around the world. Australia, the United States, but also more recently emerging countries like India. So it's not just a national inheritance we should be cherishing, it is an international one. And that is why Magna Carta, this anniversary, is being celebrated all across the free world.
Thank you very much.